Good evening, everyone. My name is Avi Lifshitz. I'm an intellectual historian of 18th century Europe here at Oxford, and on behalf of the Voltaire Foundation, I want to welcome you very warmly to the annual Besterman lecture. This lecture honors the memory of Theodore Besterman, who was the founder of the Voltaire Foundation and the first editor of the complete works of Voltaire, a very substantial enterprise that was concluded only this year with 205 volumes. We had a big celebration in March to mark this substantial achievement. This is not the end, of course, of the diverse range of projects and activities at the Voltaire Foundation. We are heavily involved in digital humanities projects at the moment and building up our profile as an Enlightenment research center with a series of academic events and programs and the well-established book series Oxford University Studies in the Enlightenment. This evening, we are very honored to host here as our annual Besterman lecturer, Professor Helena Rosenblatt of the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She is the author of Rousseau and Geneva, from the First Discourse to the Social Contract, a wonderful contextualist history published in 1997. Her second book was Liberal Values, Benjamin Constant and the Politics of Religion in 2008. And most recently, The Lost History of Liberalism from Ancient Rome to the 21st Century, published with Princeton University Press in 2018. Helena also edited or co-edited, among many other books, The Cambridge Companion to Constant in 2009, and French Liberalism from Montesquieu to the Present Day in 2012. Her current project started out as an intellectual biography of Madame de Staël, but has developed, she tells me, into a quite different animal, into a bifocal study, something that is reflected in the topic of today's lecture, which is Napoleon's nemesis, Madame de Staël, and the origins of liberalism. Professor Rosenblatt, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm so pleased and honored to be here. And thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you all for coming. Can I close this or should it remain open? It's okay. It's really strange to me that despite the blossoming of scholarship on Madame de Staël in recent years, no more has been said about her relationship with Napoleon. In general, little is even known about her, in the general public, that is. In the academic world, excellent new studies are appearing regularly, but the work doesn't seem to resonate beyond a small circle of initiates. The relative inattention to Madame de Staël is odd when you consider the reputation she enjoyed in her own lifetime. Regarded as one of the most important French writers of all time, and the most politically powerful salonière, she was at one point probably Europe's best-known enemy of Napoleon. When she arrived in London after the 10-year exile that Napoleon had imposed on her, she received a heroine's welcome. The Whig politician, Sir James Mackintosh, said that her pen was worth 50,000 soldiers, and the Prince Regent was induced by his ministers to pay her a visit because it was good politics to make her write well of England. It was said that there were three powers in Europe: England, Russia, and Madame de Staël. Today, historians, like myself in that recent book, argue that it was in Madame de Staël's drawing room, at her instigation, and under her guidance, that the cluster of concepts we refer to as liberalism was first conceived and named as such. The word liberalism was coined around 1812 in the wake of the French Revolution, and Madame de Staël and her friends were its first theorists. As Lucien Jaume put it some time ago, Madame de Staël was the mother of liberalism, and Napoleon its midwife. Madame de Staël can also be considered the mother of what we today call liberal internationalism, which had its roots in her drawing room too. among her friends and allies, and was a response to the Revolutionary Wars and especially Napoleon's brutal wars of conquest. And finally, we now know that she was instrumental in putting together the coalition that defeated the emperor at the Battle of Nations at Leipzig in 1813. So I ask, why has so little been written about this? Today, Madame de Staël is best known as a novelist and literary critic. When she is taught, which she rarely is, it's in French departments. Her novels are now considered frankly painfully boring. She is, however, celebrated as the woman who brought German philosophy to France and launched Romanticism as a literary movement. She's also regarded as an early feminist. And yes, she was all these things. But what I want to stress here is that she was an incredibly influential political writer and political actor, whose incessant activity made her one of Napoleon's most formidable, and in the end successful enemies. Madame de Staël's extraordinary personal life has attracted a number of biographers, but actually relatively few when you consider her importance. As the daughter of Jacques Necker, Louis XVI's director of finance, she was one of the wealthiest women in Europe. Along with her intellect and magnetic, larger-than-life personality, this gave her entree into the most elite circles of the Enlightenment. Her network would include philosophes, journalists, socialites, statesmen, diplomats, generals, and rulers. Her love life makes for excellent reading. According to one calculation, she had 2 husbands, 15 lovers, and 5 children from 4 different fathers. One recent biographer has asked how, given her hectic romantic life, she even had time to write. Political questions dominated her life from her childhood to her death in 1817. As a little girl, she read voraciously from her father's library, discussed what she read with him, and commented, sometimes in writing, on at least one of his treatises on political economy, on Montesquieu around the age of 12, and Rousseau. From the age of 11 or 12, she attended her mother's salon, which was dedicated to promoting her father's controversial career. He was at one point one of the most popular men in France before he fell from grace. It was in large part his firing that triggered the uprising of July 12, 1789, the taking of the Bastille, and thus the revolution itself. In her mother's salon, Minette, as she was then called, met and listened to philosophers, journalists, statesmen, and diplomats passing through Paris, who discussed all the events of the day. She met Voltaire, who was friendly with her mother, but anybody who was anybody in Paris or passing through the city came to her mother's salon. There are lovely descriptions of Minette sitting upright on a little chair next to her mother, bright-eyed and transfixed by the conversation, her marvelous eyes flashing. As a teenager, she wrote 2 novellas in favor of abolition, both of the slave trade and slavery, and as a young woman, she published several books, including one on Rousseau. After her marriage in 1786 to the Baron Stahl-Holstein, Swedish ambassador to France, Madame de Staël, now an ambassadrice, opened her own salon, which quickly became one of the city's most important political gathering places. Her father once described salon as, quote, the invisible power which, without finances, without troops, without an army, imposes its laws upon the town, on the court, and even on the king himself. Madame de Staël learned this lesson at an early age and was eager and well equipped to play a role in the unfolding events leading up to the revolution. As storm clouds gathered and the revolution approached, discussions in her salon invariably turned to constitutional matters and the pressing need for reform. Only one of the politically active regulars was the Marquis de Lafayette, who, along with Thomas Jefferson, would help write the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen in 1789. Lafayette would become a close friend. Madame de Staël joined in these conversations with gusto. Forced to flee Paris during the Terror, she returned in 1795 with the as yet unknown Benjamin Constant in her train. She promptly reopened her salon. Under her direction, attendees debated all matters of political concern, from the merits of the various constitutions that were being drafted to the handling of the French debt and the conduct of the ongoing war. Madame de Staël did more than discuss politics in her salon. She also conducted politics there. She brought together men of opposing viewpoints to help them find agreement. She used her wealth and her alliances to influence legislators, secure positions in government for her allies, and save victims of the terror. She had many bright and ambitious protégés, only one of whom was Benjamin Constant, who is now widely recognized as a founding father of liberalism, and whose career she launched and promoted, and with whom she formed a close political partnership. Experts say that it's often difficult to tell who wrote who, so tight was their collaboration. Madame de Staël wrote and co-wrote political treatises, speeches, diplomatic dispatches. She attended the opening sessions of the Estates General and reported on the ongoings in the capital to the Swedish king. So that's a bit of background on Madame de Staël, up until she met General Bonaparte in 1797. When it comes to Napoleon, so much more is known. Literally hundreds of thousands of books and articles have appeared on him, and the list keeps growing. There are movies, TV series, streets and festivals named after him, museums dedicated to him, and statues glorifying him. The hagiography of the man, still often referred to as a hero, continues, despite rather feeble attempts to appear balanced. In a recent work by a highly respected author, we hear of Napoleon's military genius and his talents as a legislator and statesman. Another writes that he laid the foundations of modern France by calming revolutionary turbulence and preserving the fundamental gains of 1789. This about a man who inaugurated total war, in the expert opinion of David Bell, and under whose military campaigns France alone counted close to 1 million deaths, while across Europe the toll may have reached as high as 5 million. Napoleon also reinstated slavery in the colonies, reduced the rights of women, ended freedom of the press, and designed a new and modern form of government, democratic despotism, to use Tocqueville's term, or illiberal democracy, if we want to use a term more current today, and the very system of government Madame de Staël tried to warn us about and arm us against. So to begin, nothing in their past suggests that their enmity and fierce battle were inevitable. They were similar in many ways. Both were outsiders. He was Corsican and spoke with an accent his whole life. Born in Paris, but of Swiss parents and married to a Swede, she was accused of being a foreigner, meddling in French affairs her whole life. Both were voracious readers and admirers of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Both had fraught relationships with their mothers. Both aspired early to literary careers. They were both equally ambitious, headstrong, convinced of their own superiority, and endowed with boundless energy. Neither was blessed with good looks. Most importantly, they were both made by the revolution. There are two different stories about how they met. One concocted by Napoleon and his friends and admirers, and obviously designed to make Madame de Staël look bad. Another by Madame de Staël, who looked back at her life and tried to build her legacy and destroy Napoleon's. The first version of their meeting goes something like this. In December of 1797, they first met in the home of Talleyrand, at a reception given in the honor of the young and famous General Bonaparte, who had just returned from conquering Italy and negotiating the Treaty of Campo Formio, by which Austria ceded its claims to Belgium and recognized the French-sponsored republics in Italy. At 28, he was the most powerful man on the continent and a national hero. It's said that Madame de Staël, who had obtained for Talleyrand his post as foreign minister, utterly embarrassed herself by pursuing the general relentlessly around the room, effusively praising him so as to get his attention, and never leaving him alone. She harassed him, Napoleon said. Josephine's daughter, Hortense, remembered that she kept following the general about all the time, boring him to a point where he could not, and perhaps did not sufficiently attempt to hide his annoyance. He tried to ignore her, was alternately cold, polite, and rude, but she was apparently impossible to shake off. Undeterred, she tried afterwards to invite him to a ball at her house. He declined, so she tried to get herself invited to every event at which he was to appear. Insulting accounts such as this have made it into some recent biographies, where Madame de Staël is described as a near stalker suffering from hero worship. It was a brief encounter, says Patrice Guénifet in an award-winning recent book, and it went nowhere, not because of their divergent political views, he says, but because from the outset he was repelled by this woman, so little in conformity with his ideal of women. Guénifet cites Heinrich Heine's account of what happened next, even while admitting that this account could very well be incorrect. Quote, "When the good lady saw that she would obtain nothing by all her persistence, she did what women do in such cases. She made great declarations of opposition to the emperor, fine arguments against his brutal and not very gallant tyranny, and went on reasoning like that until the police told her to get lost." Now, Madame de Staël recalled their first encounters quite differently. In her Considérations sur la Révolution française, published shortly after her death in 1817, she remembers that she had felt ill at ease in the general's presence. Quote, "When I had somewhat recovered from the turmoil of admiration, a very pronounced feeling of fear succeeded it. I had seen men very worthy of respect. I had also seen ferocious men. In the impression that Bonaparte made on me, there was nothing that might remind me of either the former or the latter. I perceived rather quickly, on the various occasions on which I met him during his stay in Paris, that his character could not be defined with the words we customarily use. He was neither kind, nor violent, nor sweet, nor cruel in the way of individuals we know. Such a person had no peer, could neither feel nor cause anyone else to feel any sympathy. He was more or less than a man. I felt in his soul a cold and sharp sword that froze as it wounded." Now, both stories probably contain a germ of truth. It seems more than likely that de Staël did follow the general around the room, trying to get his attention and to speak to him. It's also more than likely that she praised him effusively. That was just her style. And oblivious to her surroundings, she may very well have made a bit of a fool of herself. Constant, who obviously knew her well, they became lovers, not only intellectual partners, but also lovers, and had a daughter together, once said of her, "Strange woman, if only she could have governed herself, she might have governed the world." But Madame de Staël's goal, it seems clear to me, was to offer her services and that of her salon to Bonaparte. She most likely wanted to become his advisor, and perhaps for them to work together, to stabilize France, to save the achievements of the revolution, and bring it to a close. Like many others at the time, she thought the Republic was in grave danger, ricocheted, as it was, by attacks from the left and the right. And like others, she believed that what was needed was a strong, charismatic, and popular leader, a savior. Bonaparte posed as one. He was careful to appear absolutely loyal to the Republican government, always appearing in civilian clothes, for example, and she, like many others, believed that he could be the one. It may seem fantastic, kind of crazy from our perspective today, but after all, she had collaborated with and helped other men. She had formed alliances, some romantic, some not. Her husband, first of all, whose post as ambassador her father had arranged, and for whom she had written diplomatic dispatches to the King of Sweden. She had several protégés, among whom Benjamin Constant. She had co-written speeches, treatises, newspaper articles with other men. She had helped several in their careers through her connections. Her lovers, Narbonne, Ribbing, and now Constant. Talleyrand as well. She was a spokesperson for and defender of her father, whose partnership with her mother must have impressed her and served as a kind of model. She had written admiringly of the general and military theorist, the Comte de Guibert. And after all, She ran the most politically powerful salon in the city. Why not offer her services to the young hero Bonaparte? Why not try to enlist him in her cause and her political projects? And why would she not think that he might just be interested in and in need of her help? We know also that she had strong political and constitutional views at the time from a manuscript she wrote then, but never published, no doubt because the political situation changed. She believed that the Constitution was flawed and needed revision. New and better leaders were needed to accomplish this. The treatise is called Les circonstances actuelles qui peuvent terminer la Révolution. In it, she outlines changes she thinks must be made to the Constitution, changes mainly based on her sophisticated understanding of the English Constitution, which she admired greatly. This treatise marks the beginning of Madame de Staël's liberalism. She was not quite there yet, since at this moment in history, she actually approved of censorship and thought that the government should help Protestantism replace Catholicism, perhaps even be made France's state religion. Quite extraordinary, one might say, for a woman who would help found liberalism. But to become a full-fledged liberal, Madame de Staël needed the experience of the democratic despotism Napoleon invented, and it hadn't come yet. On the other hand, we also can understand Bonaparte. He had carefully managed his reputation so far and would prove to be a master of self-promotion propaganda. He was now courting the Directory and most certainly wanted to avoid controversy at all costs. And she was extremely controversial. And she was suspected of aristocratic leanings. In fact, she had recently been exiled by the Directory for fomenting the very royalist uprising that he had put down and that had gained him the command of the army of Italy. And in 1797, she was still being accused of royalist sympathies in both the press and in the assembly. This is no doubt why Bonaparte chose to distance himself publicly from her. Though historians have concluded that she had nothing to do with that royalist uprising and that she was genuinely in favor of the Directory at this point in time, there are good reasons why she might have been suspected of monarchist sympathies. First, during the early years of the Revolution, she had indeed been a moderate constitutional monarchist, and her father, after all, and to whom she was very close, had, as finance minister to the king, tried to save the monarchy. During Marie Antoinette's trial, she had published an appeal to the Jacobin government to spare the queen's life. She continued to have many noble friends and monarchist friends, some of whom she had helped escape during the Terror and to return thereafter. She was notoriously open-minded, generous, and loyal. When she was only recently allowed to return to Paris, she immediately reopened her salon on the Rue de Bac and again welcomed people of different persuasions, including moderate royalists. It's quite impossible that Bonaparte didn't know of her controversial reputation. It's also very possible that the infamous Talleyrand, who, as one mutual acquaintance said, owed everything to her, betrayed her by counseling him to avoid her. Not for nothing was he later called a shit in silk stockings by Napoleon. In any case, despite Bonaparte's embarrassing rejection of her, Madame de Staël did not give up. She continued for a very long time, even though she did have doubts about him, to hope that she could talk to him, reason with him, and guide him. We can only try to imagine how history would have worked out had he listened. Like many other Republicans, Madame de Staël even supported his coup d'etat in 1799, still hoping that he could be controlled and directed thereafter. But he then, of course, not only seized power for himself, but almost immediately established a highly personalized authoritarian regime that was for a long time genuinely popular, to the great frustration of Madame de Staël. Two well-known passages describe what happened. First, by Madame de Staël. It was the first time since the Revolution, she said, that a proper name was heard in every mouth. Until then, it was said the Constituent Assembly did so-and-so, the people did so-and-so, the convention. Now, no one spoke of anything except this man who needed to take the place of all and to leave the human race anonymous by monopolizing all celebrity for himself alone and preventing all other existing beings from ever being able to acquire any. And the second by Bonaparte himself in his final exile on St. Helena said, "The destiny of France depended entirely on the character, the actions, and the conscience of the man on whom it had conferred this accidental dictatorship. From that day on, the state was me. L'État, ce fut moi. I was myself the keystone of a new edifice built on such fragile foundations." Although he was showing dictatorial leanings, or perhaps even because of these dictatorial leanings, Madame de Staël redoubled her salon activities and continued to invite liberal Republicans as well as moderate royalists and tried to convince them to form a united front in favor of an English-style constitutional regime. Through her connections, she also obtained for Constant a seat on the Tribunal, one of the 4 assemblies set up by Bonaparte and whose role was to deliberate on projected laws before they were adopted by the corps législatif. In his first speech, seeing that the first consul would deprive the Tribunal of any serious role or power, Constant went over to the opposition. He pleaded for the Assembly's independence, objected to Bonaparte's emergency laws, and suggested that if he did not reverse course, he would be preparing a regime of servitude and silence. Bonaparte became furious at both Constant and Madame de Staël, since everybody assumed that she was the inspiration behind the speech, not incorrectly, I would say. She was, in fact, immensely proud of the speech, which she had more than likely helped Constant write, and she had planned a big dinner for him afterwards. But learning of the first consul's anger, her guests offered apologies and chose not to come. She found herself alone without friends. Her salon was placed under surveillance, and it emptied out. Napoleon's Minister of Police called her to his office and suggested that she spend some time in the country. The press let loose a virulent invective against her. The Jacobin press said, "It's not your fault if you're ugly, but it is your fault if you're an intriguer. Go back home and take with you your Benjamin." Nevertheless, Madame de Staël wouldn't give up. When she returned to Paris, instead of letting things go, she continued her pursuit, still hoping that Bonaparte could be persuaded with rational arguments. She wrote to Talleyrand to ask him to invite her to a ball he was giving where Bonaparte was sure to be. In the name of friendship, Talleyrand asked her not to come. Shunned by society, Madame de Staël became very discouraged, but not for long. She found another way to influence events. In April of 1800, she published De la Littérature. Today, this text is recognized as a path-breaking work of literary theory, but it's also clear that it delivered, in an only somewhat veiled way, some stern lessons to the budding dictator. Without specifically naming Benjamin Constant, she wrote, "In a republic, it is necessary for every man of talent to be an obstacle to political usurpation." The first consul's glory, she suggested, could only be obtained with the support of such men of talent, intellectuals and writers, in other words, and he should listen to them. Writers should also be given complete liberty to write and say what they wished. Moreover, she suggested that he should align himself with the ideals of the Enlightenment, and in particular with the Enlightenment ideal of perfectibility, by which Madame de Staël surely meant progress toward freedom and not reversal and return towards authoritarian ways of government. Of course, she knew that Napoleon was at the time precisely distancing himself from Enlightenment notions such as progress and perfectibility, claiming that they were too metaphysical, in other words, impractical. He was now more inclined to look to the past for ideas of government and models of leadership. He wanted people to think of him as a second Caesar or Charlemagne. An anonymous article in the Journal des Débats praised him as the man who had recovered from naive illusions of perfectibility. I quote, "The genius that today presides over the destiny of France is a genius of wisdom. He won't lose himself in vain theories and does not seek glory from systems. He knows that men are, and always have been, the same and cannot change their nature, and that it is in the past that he will find lessons to fix the present. Notably, Madame de Staël also warned against what she called the military spirit in de la littérature. Nations, she declared, should not make war with each other, but rather serve as guides for one another. Now I ask you, was this book, which was enormously successful, an anti-Napoleonic manifesto, or was it another somewhat awkward effort to advise him? I think it was a bit of both. Perhaps it was not too late to think that he might just come around. But over the course of the next 2 years, Bonaparte instead negotiated the Concordat with the Pope, which re-established the Catholic Church in France. He purchased the tribunal of those who dared to oppose him, and, after a string of military and diplomatic victories, a plebiscite endowed him with the position of first consul for life. Through his brother Joseph, who had managed to stay on friendly terms with them both, he delivered a message to Madame de Staël. He told his brother to warn this woman, advise her not to try to block me, or I will break her, I will crush her, make her be quiet. But of course she would not be quiet. Instead, she upped the ante. In 1802, she published the blockbuster-selling novel Delphine, that everybody would talk about, and she dedicated it to silent France. Delphine is an epistolary novel describing the life of an independent woman during the French Revolution. It could not but have infuriated Bonaparte. Some parts of it read like a pamphlet against Catholicism and in favor of Protestantism. This right after he had negotiated the Concordat with the Pope. She praised England, quote, this moral, religious, and free nation, whose civil, religious, and political institutions I admire in almost every sense, which, at the time, was quite like making war on Bonaparte. And the novel praised divorce, when everyone knew that he was opposed to divorce, and would severely restrict it in his civil code. I cannot stand that woman, he shouted after reading the book, and it seems that he himself published one anonymous attack on it. In his final exile on St. Helena, Napoleon apparently reread the novel, but it disturbed him so much he couldn't finish it. He threw it on the floor and hissed, "I hate that woman." Soon after its publication, Madame de Staël received the order of exile. She was to leave Paris and stay at least 160 kilometers away from the city, and so began her 10 years of exile from her beloved Paris. First from Paris, but because she kept defying Bonaparte's orders and sneaking back into the city, then she was not from all of France. She had to stay away from all of France. What irritated Bonaparte perhaps even more than her writings were her activities in the salon. He knew their power and the opposition she was encouraging there. As he told the Austrian foreign minister Metternich, he could not allow her in the capital because she is a perpetual motion machine who stirs up the salon. He knew very well, as he then added, if I let her come to Paris, she would make trouble. She would lose me the men around me. And as he lay sick and dying on St. Helena, he would grumble, her salon was fatal. She gathered in it all the partisans, Republicans, and Royalists. She put them in each other's presence. She united them all against me. She attacked me from all sides. Accompanied by Constant, Madame de Staël went into exile at her chateau in Coppet, Switzerland, near Geneva, a property her father had bought some years ago and where she would spend most of the time in the next 10 years. But of course, we know her now. She would not be cowed. On the contrary, she now turned her chateau into a bastion of liberal opposition to Napoleon. The truth is that by exiling her, he only made matters worse for himself. It only increased her reputation and power. Coppet became a place where his enemies from all over Europe could come and freely discuss literature, politics, and whatever he was doing to France and Europe. And she made trips to Germany and Italy, where she was welcomed by intellectual and political elites wherever she went, and where she consorted openly with his enemies. She corresponded with the German political journalist, for example, Friedrich Gentz, a pupil of Kant, translator of Edmund Burke, and one of Napoleon's leading opponents, who was then busy writing pamphlets, manifestos, and newspaper articles advocating resistance to his rule. By 1804, Napoleon's grip on power was complete, and he was declared emperor. The constitution of that year establishing the empire was approved in a plebiscite by more than 3,500,000 votes against about 2,500. But Napoleon still found it necessary to spy on Madame de Staël and harass her. He kept track of her every movement, writing letters to his minister of police about her even during critical military campaigns. On New Year's Eve 1806, he wrote to his chief of police from Poland, "Don't let this mischievous child get close to Paris." 3 months later, he reiterated the order, "You must observe the execution of my orders and not allow Madame de Staël to approach Paris by more than 40 lieues." When his chief of police assured him that she was not in Paris, the emperor responded that the chief of police was misinformed. She was in Paris having dinners with other writers. And the emperor was right. He had many sources of information, other spies in his employment. In April 1807, he expressed pleasure that he hadn't heard anything about her for a while. And then the very next day, he unleashed a violent diatribe due to something he had heard about her. "My intention is that she never leaves Geneva. Her politics irritate him no end," and he adds, "she is ugly to boot." Again, a month later, he wrote, "Every day I get more proof that it is impossible to be worse than this woman, enemy of the government and even of France." The outcomes of Madame de Staël's exile and trips were her highly acclaimed and influential novel Corinne, ou l'Italie, published in 1807, or De l'Allemagne, first published in 1810. Corinne was such a success that its heroine was pictured on biscuit boxes, and it's this novel that Madame de Staël became most famous for. It is once again a story of an extraordinary woman, a poet this time, who many people took and continue to take for a stand-in for Madame de Staël herself. But it's equally a homage to Italy, its beauty, its literature, its art. Without naming him, she once again condemned Napoleon on every page, with the novel's evocation of Italy, which of course had now been defeated and dismembered, and his art, which had been plundered by his armies, its message was more than clear. In one iconic scene, Madame de Staël even placed Jean-Louis David's painting of Brutus, which evoked resistance to despotic monarchy, in a prominent position in Corinne's home. Meanwhile, in the years between 1807 and 1810, her salon at Coppet reached the height of its glory. Her home became, Napoleon said, an armory of weapons against me. Stendhal called it the Estates General of European thought. She regularly hosted as many as 20 guests overnight and 40 for dinner. And this is when Benjamin Constant, her partner and lover, although they had a very turbulent relationship, this is when he wrote his now famous treatise, Principe de Politique, today regarded as a founding document of liberalism. Having experienced both the terror and the despotism of Napoleon, Madame de Staël and he had learned just how important individual rights were, no matter the form of government, whether it was monarchy or republic. Power emanated from the people, yes, but unbounded popular sovereignty was a very dangerous thing. From the outset, after all, Napoleon had recognized the sovereignty of the people, and he continued to do so, but he saw himself as being its one and only incarnation, and maintained this to the very end. La France est en moi. France was in him, he repeated until 1815. In the Principe de Politique, Benjamin Constant advocated a system of government, a liberal form of government, which had representation, intermediaries, divisions of power, and safeguards such as individual rights, among which freedom of the press and religion were among the most important. And it was here and now that Madame de Staël wrote her On Germany. Among other things, it was an answer to the French annihilation of Prussian forces at the Battle of Vienna and its occupation of territory extending far into Europe. And it was yet another thinly disguised critique of Napoleon and a call to arms against him. Its very title was, of course, a provocation, and her evocation of German patriotism said it all. Upon its publication in 1810, Napoleon immediately destroyed its 10,000 copies. Luckily, one copy was salvaged, and Madame de Staël was able to publish the book in London in 1813 to great acclaim. In May of 1811, Madame de Staël was told that she was not permitted to set foot anywhere on French territory and was advised not to travel further than 2 leagues from her home in Coppet. Basically, she was placed under house arrest, and her friends were ordered to leave her. On the afternoon, that was May of 1812, not 1811. On the afternoon of May 23rd, having heard that she might be under arrest, she pretended to go for a short drive, since Napoleon had planted spies inside her home. But instead, she set out on a long and dangerous voyage eastwards through Germany, Austria, Poland, to Russia, and on to Sweden, and finally to England. Napoleon exiled me, she said, and I became European. Once it was discovered that she had escaped, she was followed by plainclothes police everywhere she went, and they reported back to the emperor. She was well received by her host everywhere and given the opportunity to read passages from her writings, especially from On Germany, which brought tears to the eyes of her auditors. To understand why, we need only to understand how brutal was the impact of Napoleon's preparations for the Russian campaign across most of the German lands, and how much her descriptions of German culture and her invocations of German patriotism could move and inspire them. Reading on Germany in 1814, when Germany had risen in arms, Goethe remarked, quote, "The French police, intelligent enough to understand that such a work must bolster German self-confidence, wisely had it destroyed. At the present moment, the book produces an astonishing effect. If it had been published earlier, one might have imputed the great events that just took place to its influence." On Germany is also a text that we can say helped launch a kind of liberal internationalism, a new theory of international affairs based on a common commitment to peace and progress. In his landmark study, The Transformation of European Politics, Paul Schroeder describes Madame de Staël as the decisive turning point in the transformation of the governing rules, norms, and practices of international politics. She urged European powers to commit to something larger than their short-term individual interests. There was something she referred to as the cause of Europe, which was also the cause of humanity. For Napoleon, Europe was only a word, she said. Rulers needed to come together and realize that they had a common mission, to defeat Napoleon's monstrous system and create a long-lasting European peace. He was not just a man, she said. He was a system, and it was the system that needed to be defeated, not just the man. It was about building trust and finding common ground. No more divide and rule, no more shifting alliances for short-term objectives. Rather, the pursuit of common and noble objectives and an honest commitment to peace and progress. She made it clear that this coming together in the name of progress should not in any way involve imposing the same form of rule on every country. Although she preferred the English system of government to all others, she respected difference and denounced the revolutionaries' attempt to impose French principles on the conquered territories and Napoleon's goal of establishing a universal monarchy. Singular mania to compel all countries to adopt a political organization similar to that of France. There are doubtless principles common to all countries, such as those which secure the civil rights of free people. But of what consequence is it whether there should be a limited monarchy, as in England, or a federal republic like the United States, or what exists in the 13 Swiss cantons? And was it necessary to reduce Europe to a single idea, like the Roman people to a single head, in order to be able to command and to change the whole in one day? Madame de Staël now became like a moving think and do tank, mobilizing collective action against the warmongering dictator. In July of 1812, she crossed into Russia and spent 8 weeks there, possibly accomplishing a critical piece of diplomacy, which was to bring Russia and Sweden to trust each other and form a new military coalition against Napoleon. And this would be the sixth coalition that eventually defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Leipzig in October of 1813. In Russia, she met not only with Russian nobles and princes, but also with foreign diplomats, the British, American, and Spanish ambassador. She met with the Tsar. The exact details what happened now are still a bit murky. Perhaps there is information buried in the Russian or Swedish archives. I hope so. But after speaking with the Tsar, Madame de Staël left for Sweden with one of her goals being to convince the Swedish crown prince that this was a wise course to ally with Russia. It so happens that the Swedish crown prince was Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, former marshal to Napoleon. He was a friend of Madame de Staël since the 1790s, when he had attended her salon in Paris. Bernadotte had been elected crown prince of Sweden in 1810 because the Swedish king Charles XIII had no children, and also because Sweden was afraid of Russia, having just lost Finland to it. Bernadotte would rule as Charles XIV John, Karl XIV Johan. The current king of Sweden, Karl XVI Gustav, is his descendant. The Swedes who got Bernadotte elected were impressed by his military credentials and thought that his relationship with Napoleon would please France. But soon upon his arrival in Stockholm, Bernadotte began to distance himself from Napoleon. Bernadotte was a believer in constitutional monarchy, which endeared him, of course, to Madame de Staël, who actually hoped for a while that he could be made King of France once Napoleon was defeated. Convincing the Swedes to enter an alliance against the French would not be an easy task. On September 24, Madame de Staël disembarked at Stockholm. The news of her arrival, the French chargé d'affaires reported to Paris, produced the effect of a bombshell. She immediately opened a salon, and Bernadotte received her like an old friend. She calls on the Prince Royal at all hours, reported the French chargé d'affaires. He tells her everything. Meanwhile, she was in constant touch with the Russian government. Negotiations sometimes took place in her apartment, where she received the entire diplomatic corps, except for the French chargé d'affaires. In the end, it was she who convinced Bernadotte to trust Alexander, and in 1812, under Bernadotte's leadership, Sweden was the first power to join Russia in the formation of a sixth coalition. Certainly, no single person did more to push Sweden into the sixth coalition as a full partner than did Madame de Staël, and by promoting Sweden's entry into the war, she played a decisive role in Napoleon's defeat. A Frenchman held the destiny of the world in his hands, Napoleon at St. Helena said of Bernadotte. He was one of the principal, direct causes of our misfortunes. Imagine then how perplexed I am to read in a highly celebrated and award-winning recent biography of Napoleon that Madame de Staël's power never had any effect on him, and that this biography has reduced her to the role of a mere commentator on events, or why another celebrated biographer wonders how a woman with such a turbulent love life and several children could find the time even to write on politics. I hope you understand why I quite want to set the record straight. Madame de Staël was Napoleon's most resolute and persistent opponent, his nemesis, and in the end, she brought him down.